Students of intellectual history, if they're willing to use the term Renaissance at all, very often will refer to the Renaissance of the 13th century, or sometimes 12th and 13th century, which is a rather coy way of saying that the term Renaissance lends itself to a variety of interpretations. It is at once a way of calling attention to some of the great achievements of the 12th and 13th centuries. It's also a way of calling attention to the fact that the term Renaissance was a 19th century invention, chiefly by aesthetes, by scholars in the field of history of art and architecture, who would find in Florence of the Quattrocento a recovery of certain architectural and artistic forms quite common in the classical period, in the ancient period, hence the rebirth of that particular genre of art and architecture, sculpture, painting, etc. Now, I don't think there's much wrong with such terms as medieval, Renaissance, and the like, unless we allow them to control our judgment of actual events and persons. For example, when we use a term like Renaissance, we are led insensibly to the view that something has been actually reborn, having earlier died. So the relevant question, if we have in mind the Italian Renaissance, is just what it was that had died, only to be reborn in Florence in the 1400s. Now, to be sure, the Florentines thought that they knew, and that the aesthetes of the 19th century surely thought that they knew what it was that had died and what it was that somehow got reborn. Whatever had died must have once lived, and so the question that naturally arises for us is, well, what is it that was once so alive that it was now worth reviving so many centuries later, in the interval it having somehow died? Textbook answers to this question are entirely unsatisfying. To be told that the Italian Renaissance recovered the classical ideals of ancient Greece and Rome is especially unhelpful in several ways. First, there were profound differences between Hellenic and Roman civilization themselves. Second, if what is meant by Hellenic and Hellenistic civilization is a self-perfectionist goal achieved through deep and disciplined philosophical inquiry, then the Italian Renaissance has very little in common with that. Third, in light of the rich and indeed committed philosophical undertakings of the later medieval period, there's no basis at all on which to suggest that this part of the classical achievement had in any sense died. It would be no exaggeration to say that if we wish to consider the rebirth of one of the defining features of the classical world, our attention actually should be focused on the Hellenic Islamic world of the commentators on Aristotle in the 11th century, and more so on the medieval universities of Britain and on the European continent in the 12th and 13th centuries. I say, these featured activities that would have been recognized by the great ancient philosophers as repeating and reviving and refining what the ancients had been up to all along. It is in these developments that we find a much more secure and settled West recovering its own traditions, these being classically established traditions. Consider Peter Abelard, whose life stretches from 1079 to 1142, and whose celebrated teaching earned him the title of, the title was actually Peripateticus Palatinus. A palatine here suggests a form of lordship, and the peripatetics, that was a term historically assigned to the school of Aristotle. So here you have a lordship in the domain of Aristotelian thought. Abelard's own teacher was the philosophically acute Anselm, whose instruction was a staple in Roman Catholic higher education less than 2 centuries after Alcuin had reformed education throughout the Holy Roman Empire. Now, I'm citing these facts to underscore the true and extraordinary rebirth of learning in the 12th century that not only predates the Italian Renaissance, but, I'm inclined to say, actually makes it possible. This great awakening faced very high hurdles. Even with the educational reforms begun in the age of Charlemagne, the teaching of the Church was dominated by the mystical visions of a Saint Bernard rather than the rational apparatus of an Aristotelian. It is not surprising that Abelard would be condemned by Bernard himself as one who, quote, deems himself able by human reason to comprehend God altogether, close quote. Now, nonetheless, by 1113, he had been awarded a chair in theology at the prestigious Cathedral School of Paris, soon becoming the most sought-after and celebrated teacher of his time. It was Abelard's sic et non, his yes and no, that allowed readers to see the contradictions and inconsistencies in the works of the early church fathers. His autobiography, which he titled An Account of My Misfortunes, Historia Calamatum, an account of my calamities, is a summary of the envy and resentment aroused by his formidable intelligence and philosophical powers, and especially by his tragic love affair with the brilliant Heloise. Both would end their days in the cloistered solitude of the religious orders. Abelard, turning to a monkish life, he says, more out of disgrace than a sense of vocation. Nonetheless, the latter grew in proportion as the former waned. The treatise Sic et Non employs a method of teaching not invented by Abelard, but developed by him to a greater extent than it had reached by his time. The overarching issues were those arising from Aristotle's logical treatises, for his naturalistic and ethical works were still awaiting migration from east to west. The method calls for the presentation of a major thesis or proposition, the arguments favoring it, the arguments opposing it, and then a conclusion judged to be warranted by the force of the argument on each side. The method, of course, is that used in a less formal way by Socrates and in a developed way by the sophists of old. In Sic et Non, 158 such propositions are submitted to analysis, covering a range of problems in metaphysics, theology, and ethics. A burning issue at the time, and one that still warrants careful consideration, has to do with the ontological status of universals. Now let me take a breath here. When we say that Fido is a member of the universal class or set dog, how is the latter to be understood? Does such a universal really exist? Or is it merely the name we give to that inclusion set in which all actual individual dogs are found? Now, radical positions were defended in Abelard's time. A radical nominalism which insisted that universals are nothing but class names, and a radical realism according to which the universal must be real or else there couldn't be individuals that possess the relevant attributes. It was Abelard who drew attention to the idleness of such controversies and to the limitations that are inherent in both radical positions. He dismissed the notion that there is some really existing thing that is a universal, but argued that the mind conceptualizes and organizes particulars into universal classes on the basis of really existing and defining attributes. Now, this sort of common sense can get one in trouble, even without the added burden of a condemned romance. The first half of the 13th century hosted yet another revival. I mentioned Abelard as reviving a central part of the philosophical program. This time, it's the revival of experimental science. But before I go into this, a few remarks are in order about experimental science in the ancient Greek world. Secondary sources routinely highlight the abstract nature of Hellenic and Hellenistic thought. And perhaps to accentuate the abstract philosophical dimensions of that achievement, they often underestimate the scientific achievements of the Hellenic and Hellenistic world. It would take a separate series of lectures even to begin to cover the extraordinary technical and basic science work that was accomplished in Hellenic and Hellenistic Greece. I've already devoted a lecture to the Hippocratics and to Greek medicine, and I have noted the great contributions that Aristotle made to the natural and biological sciences. But in physics and in astronomy, the shape of the Earth, the distance between the Earth and the Sun, navigational principles, general astronomical theories to account for celestial dynamics, mechanical principles of mechanical advantage. This was a world rich in insights into basic physics and to some extent even into chemistry and the chemistry of the material world. In the 6th century BC, Theodorus of Samos developed a means by which to smelt and cast ore, and seems to have invented a turning lathe for carpentry. Alcmaeon, a member of the Pythagorean school of medicine, traced sensory anatomy to the brain and may well have dissected the optic nerve. Theophrastus, who succeeded Aristotle as master of the Lyceum, showed that certain precious stones become charged when subjected to heat. In a word, the ancient Greeks were no strangers to applied and theoretical science. Now, Aristotle is almost a twin pair in one body. He's a man for all intellectual seasons. Entire ages can be found that identify Aristotle as that great logic-chopping father of syllogistic reasoning and metaphysical treatises. Still, other centers of scholarship and scholarly thought seeing in Aristotle one of the premier natural scientists that the world will ever produce. And then, of course, we have yet other ages devoted to showing that he didn't really understand anything at all. Dear Aristotle. Now, in his third millennium, as a major unemployment service for the thinking classes, I should say, Aristotle is still the philosopher of choice if you want to write a PhD dissertation showing that you might be much cleverer than someone who died in 322 BC. Well, let me return to the 13th century, when again, thanks very much to Islamic commentaries on Hellenic texts, the West begins to recover Aristotle, the natural scientist, and sees in these Aristotelian works the possibility for genuinely progressive knowledge. Two figures of immense importance are found at the already thriving University of Oxford, both members of the Catholic clergy, and both among the most instructed minds of their century. In Robert Grosseteste, Testa, the Bishop of Lincoln, we find a scholar as much at home with optics as with theology. His dates are 1175 to 1253. His commentaries on Aristotle were authoritative well into the 16th century. Significantly, in addition to commentaries on the ethical treatises, he also studied and wrote on Aristotle's physics. And by the time of his death, he had created at Oxford an interest in science, in which his young student, Roger Bacon, would come to call experimental science. Now, Roger Bacon's great work, his Opus Maius, is one of the foundational works in the modern scientific movement. And I shall read some passages from that and some related texts in a few minutes. Scholasticism and its allegedly logic-chopping penchants was in fact an attempt to rationalize the teachings of the Church, to rationalize what is essentially a Christian doctrinal understanding of the universe, its purpose, its cause, its end. Doctrinal decrees in the 13th century left no doubt but that God had created the universe out of nothingness, and that as an expression of the divine mind, this same universe was ordered in a rational manner. Both of these doctrines were an invitation to forms of inquiry that would evolve into experimentation. The further understanding, reinforced by the works of Thomas Aquinas, is that Christian faith and the facts of science can't be in conflict because both reach truths about the same thing, the same creation. You might need some sort of algorithm or translation device to get from one to the other. But there's no fundamental tension between the perspective of the natural philosopher or the natural scientist and the perspective of the theological or religious person. Now, there is something else in Christian teaching, as celebrated by the scholastics, and here there is a debt, and an acknowledged debt, to Augustine and some of the early Christian fathers. We have an obligation to know God. It is a positive duty to acquaint ourselves with our Father, to understand the sense in which we have been created in His image and likeness. Now, you know the Maker by His works, and so scholastic scholarship recognizes the central place of what might be called a scientific inquiry, otherwise within a life of faith. The scientific inquiry becomes one of the modes by which we know God, one of the ways we come to know the otherwise unreachable, immaterial, insubstantial divinity. How is it? It's through the material manifestations of His plan. And the scientist then is engaged in what, understood in a certain way, an essentially theological undertaking. So let me rehearse that one more time. If it is an obligation on the Christian conscience to know God, and if to know God is to know God through His works, I say this is a veritable invitation to inquiry of a naturalistic and scientific nature. So again, there isn't a war between science and religion. It's one thing to say that the medieval period hadn't quite worked out experimental science as Galileo or Newton and so forth did in the 17th century. But it's quite another thing to describe that period as either hostile to or aloof to what we would take to be the teachings, the methods, the contributions of the scientific enterprise. Now, what else does experimental science engage us in? Well, we apply our senses to God's creation. And the evidence of sense then has to be integrated into a more rational framework. A more integrated and rational framework, after all, just is the broader scientific framework. Now, even if one is committed to rationalism, to an essentially rational or logical approach to truth, well, rationality and logic have to work on something. And what is it that they work on? They work on the available facts of the world. So all knowledge begins with certain core facts, accessible to the senses, and these facts then become collected and integrated into a systematic form now judged to be governed by universal laws. That recovered Aristotelian canon is going to be richly pursued by a cadre of scholars, chiefly at Oxford and later at the University of Paris. There's a passage in Bacon's Opus Maius that's worth more than 1,000 of my words. I give you this quote from Roger Bacon. Quote, "I now wish to unfold the principles of experimental science, since without experience nothing can be sufficiently known." Close quote. Well, how about that? Absent direct sensory commerce with the physical world, knowledge is jejune. It's empty. It would just be words. He goes on to say, "For there are two modes of acquiring knowledge, namely by reasoning and experience. Reasoning draws the conclusion and makes us grant the conclusion, but does not make the conclusion certain, nor does it remove doubt so that the mind may rest on the intuition of truth, unless the mind discovers it by the path of experience." Close quote. The logician instructs us in the science of logic, noting that if all men are mortal, and if Socrates is a man, well, then necessarily Socrates is mortal. But notice that this gets us nowhere except insofar as we know what is meant by men. And we know who Socrates is. And now we can relate this rationally certain, rationally conclusive argument to the facts of experience. No one ever died as a conclusion of a valid syllogism. Aristotle had taught that, quote, Proof is reasoning that causes us to know, close quote. And Bacon understood that this required as a proviso that the proof is accompanied by its appropriate experience and is not to be understood as the bare proof of a syllogism. Thus he says, quote, "He therefore who wishes to rejoice without doubt in regard to the truth's underlying phenomenon must know how to devote himself to experiment," close quote. What an incredible statement of purpose. What a pedagogically rich, instructive, guiding precept. Who would have said such a thing in the 4th century AD? I'm not sure. I know many who would have said such a thing in 1400. Bacon understands that we are equipped with two modes of knowing, and that the problem of knowledge can be addressed via two paths. There is indeed a rational route. We are rational creatures. We're made in the image and likeness of God. This rationality is a reflection of the Maker in his works. This is the means by which we come to know God. It's the means by which we come to know ourselves and our place in the world. Ourselves and our place in the world, well, we are in the world. We come to know God by his works. And one cannot know anything merely by fashioning abstract, rational depictions of what it might be. No, knowledge is first about something, about what is gleaned by the senses, by the facts of experience. But it is not just the unorganized facts of experience. It calls for something deeper than looking and gaping or listening and sniffing. Experience must be disciplined and ordered, and this is what experimentation achieves. This is that form of systematic, disciplined observation under conditions in which you have more or less controlled things so that you can be fairly certain of just what it is you're looking at. Now, I do not present here Roger Bacon as an early Galileo or Newton or Robert Boyle. The actual experiments conducted by Roger Bacon and his colleagues are interesting. He does use an opal stone, for example, and with it he's able to divide sunlight into the colors of the spectrum, and therefore show that white light is made up of constituents. This, by the way, in other words, was not first done by Isaac Newton. And he does make functional spectacles, actual eyeglasses to make things more visible. Not bad. And there was much more. But far more important than the actual experiments were his comments on what he called, quote, the sin of ignorance, and the need for the clergy to be scientifically informed. In the matter of what we would call scientific findings, there's something much more important than the finding itself. And what's more important than the finding itself is the method of finding itself. Experimental science now, in the hands of Robert Grosseteste and Roger Bacon, becomes part of the ethics of Christian life. It becomes a duty, as it were. It's not a depreciation of the world to examine it at the sensory level, even though it would be a depreciation to leave it at the sensory level. The great medieval Christian philosopher Duns Scotus put the case in yet another way. Quote, "As for what is known by experience, I have this to say. Even though a person does not experience every single individual, but only a great many, nor does he experience them at all times, but only frequently, still he knows infallibly that it is always this way, and holds for all instances," close quote. Now, you know what he's getting at here, don't you? This is a forerunner of what is now called the frequentist probability approach, probabilistic knowledge, establishing an inductive inference as a permissible mode of knowledge. Once you've sampled a number of cases and you see that things work out, remember Aristotle's Hosepi to pouli, by and large, for the most part, in general, well, you don't have to wait for an infinite time to consult every single instance. By inference, by logical inference, by a plausible, rational mode of thought, you can lay claim to understanding how this will be under all circumstances, no matter how many times it's sampled. So, to continue with Duns Scotus, quote, even though a person does not experience every single individual, but only a great many instances, still he knows infallibly that it is always this way, and holds for all instances, close quote. Moreover, he knows this in virtue of something, quote, reposing in his soul. He knows it intuitively. Now, this is the proposition that he knows intuitively. Put another way, in the words of Duns Scotus again, quote, whatever occurs in a great many instances by a cause that is not free is the natural effect of that cause. This proposition is known to the intellect even if derived from erring senses, close quote. You see what's going on here. There is an actual philosophy of science being developed in these texts. Here's a justification for experimental science itself, a justification if I ever saw one. What the proposition is this. You take a fairly large sample, you see what the general pattern of outcomes is. You have every right to conclude by inference that there is a general law controlling these things. You know that you can't observe every event for all time to come. Nonetheless, your knowledge is infallible when the pattern is so securely repeated a given number of times. Now, the Platonist might contend that from a limited number of observations, each one of them corrupted by the imperfections of sense, the inferences drawn are illicit. There's no way of knowing what the next outcome is going to be because there is imperfect knowledge on the part of only one. It is precisely to this criticism, however, that Duns Scotus offers the common sense rebuttal. Duns Scotus, Robert Grosseteste, Roger Bacon, they're defending a mode of thought in the scholastic period that is characteristic of that period, though also original and groundbreaking. There's something quite commonsensical about it all, even amidst the analytical rigor and the formal arguments. This comes about in a very considerable measure as a result of Christian teaching itself, the requirement that we know God through his creation, an inquiry into our own nature, because by way of imago Dei, to know oneself is to know something of God. So again, this is not an age hostile to the senses, indifferent to experimental modes of inquiry. There's nothing dark about this period at all. It's an age of great intellectual energy, which seems to some extent rather innocent and remote, because it really is restoring something briefly misplaced. If Greek philosophy has too long laid fallow, if scholars in the West have not yet recovered the habitual and sure-handed use of ancient intellectual resources, there is now at least the beginning of a full recovery. The labors of medieval scholarship, particularly within the context of the university, the corpus of scholastic teaching and scholastic thought, methodology, criticism and analysis, will revive the noblest traditions of the West. Every age is fairly confident that its perspective is the modern perspective. Modern here is not simply the most recent word, however, and it certainly isn't the last word. All of the witch hunters were using the best evidence. They were using refined legal procedures, refined rules of evidence, right kinds of tests, etc. They were hunting witches. So we're always quite confident in our science, quite confident in our religion and our philosophy, which is why I generally end a lecture of this sort by saying that when your confidence has reached a really high level in these regards, particularly everything that can be learned experimentally and by reason, by direct observation, by analyticity, by linguistic analysis, by a consultation with cultural historians and anthropologists, so that you're absolutely certain you've got the thing nailed down, then what I would urge as a therapy is to move in front of a mirror and say, I may be wrong. I may be gravely wrong. I may be hopelessly, irretrievably wrong. And in that, you may very well be right.